videnskabsmanden og pacifisten John Scales Avery giver oversigt over sine bogudgivelser om de udfordringer, menneskeheden står overfor. The scientist and peace activist John Scales Avery tells here about his many books relevant for mankind today. Interviewet er fra den 20. april 2020 og foregår på engelsk. Så Averys modersmål. Jeg har ringet til videnskabsmanden John Avery, og du er også aktiv for at skabe fred i verden som pacifist. Du har skrevet mange videnskabelige afhandlinger, og du har skrevet bøger om, han har sagt, hvad det skal være næsten, men det er især fred og klima, og du har der skrevet en bog om coronaens konsekvenser, og hvad vi kan gøre med det som udgangspunkt. Jeg ved ikke, hvad du vil snakke om, men det bestemmer du selv. Du ved, hvad der er væsentligt at fortælle os danskere, og også de, der kan engelsk, fordi du vil helst snakke på engelsk, og det forstår jeg godt, fordi du er jo indvandrer til Danmark som født amerikaner, så modersmålet, det udtrykker man sig bedst på, og specielt som videnskabsmand, så skal nuancerne jo med, og så må jeg så prøve mere, og især lytterne med, kan forstå det hele. Ja, for jeg er nødt til at snakke dansk. Ja, værsgo, John Avery.
Thank you very, very much for having me on your program. I think that your work is extremely important now because we need the alternative media to give us the truth when the mass media give us instead the lies of the power holders in our society. I admire your work very much and think this is extremely essential. And it's kind of you to ask me to say a little bit about my writing. I think that I started writing books about the serious problems that the world is facing today in 2003 because I was very angry at the invasion of Iraq by George W. Bush and the United States together with some other countries. And so I wrote Space Age Science and Stone Age Politics at that time. I had a friend in the Pugwash conferences on science and technology, which I have attended since 1990. And he sent me some of his writings, and I, in return, sent him this book. And he is a very famous Pakistani scientist, a physicist, and he also has a publishing company and an educational website. So that was the beginning of my association with this website that has published most of my books. And this particular book was through Professor Hudbahoy. It was translated into Urdu. Some of my other books have been translated into Farsi, the Persian language. But that was the first really political book that I wrote. But later, in the years 2012 through 2014, I wrote about one article every week, and these were published on the Internet by the Internet journal Countercurrents, and also by the Transcend Media Service Weekly Digest. And so those are collected in the collected essays. I think there's about 150 articles that were written at that time. I would say that in the last few years, I have been writing in a special way where I make full use of things that I've written previously. First of all, I have the idea of the topic about which I want to write, and then I got to collect everything that I've written previously about it, and I have no inhibition about using the things that I've written previously in a different context, and then I add to it. So I'm always adding to what I've written previously, but I use those things. And that's the way I've written the book, very recent book, Rebuilding After Corona, which tells about what we have to do to make a better world after the corona pandemic is finally finished. And the other recent book you can see in the list of books which Arne is going to make available on his website, Lives in Poetry, and that's part of a series of books. By now there are 9 of them, about a new way of teaching history. I believe that history ought to be taught not as political history, not as the history of power struggles and conflicts, but rather as the history of the slow development of human culture, to which all nations and all ethnic groups have contributed. And this history ought to give full credit to all of the various ethnic groups and nations that have cooperatively produced the wonderful edifice of culture that we have today. I believe that that's the way history ought to be taught. So, Lives in Poetry, and see some other ones, Lives in Astronomy, Lives in Chemistry, Lives in Medicine, and so on, all part of that series. Then another recent book is called Linked Dangers to Civilization. This tells the story of not only the dangers of the coronavirus, but also other very serious dangers that we are facing. Danger of thermonuclear war, dangers of a very serious famine that might come at the middle of the present century because of population growth and climate change. Danger from excessive economic inequality. All of these dangers are in fact linked to each other, and they are discussed in that book. Another book that I've written quite recently is called Our Children's Future, and that book starts from the point of view that we all try very hard to protect our children and to take care of them, but it makes no sense to do so unless we give them and their children and all future generations a world in which they can survive. And so that, again, repeats a little bit what it repeats the tasks that we have before us in order to make a better future. We have to absolutely have a better more adequate response to the challenge of the threat of catastrophic climate change. And we must get rid of the institution of war for the sake of our children. And, of course, to do that, we have to build international governance, to reform the United Nations and to make it into a federation capable of making laws that are binding on individuals. So that is a book about the tasks that we have before us. Another book, a recent book, is called Terrorism, a False Threat. And that has its start in a review of the official version of the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center in New York, which is absolutely false, demonstrably false. And one can easily show the falsehoods and lies in the official version of 9/11. But that event was used by George W. Bush to initiate his so-called war on terror. And first of all, war on terror is a ridiculous idea because war is a form of terrorism. And terrorism also is not something that is it's not an act of nations, it's an act of individuals against which police action would be appropriate. But this book shows the terrible consequences of war, not only wars, but also torture and other terrible acts that have been excused by the so-called war on terror. And if we look at terrorism carefully, we can see that it is trivial. The number of people killed by terrorism is vanishingly small compared, for example, with the number of people killed in automobile accidents. So it is really a false threat, and it has been used to excuse very terrible actions. Another recent book is called Fighting for America's Soul. And this really is a fight that continues today. We know that Trump is the most evil and dangerous president in American history, and his presidency has been a continuous attack on constitutional government. So there's a deep split in American opinion. Trump has his supporters, but many good people in America, the progressives, who are fighting to save the real idea of America as a idealistic, freedom-loving and democratic country from this new terrible situation where democratic institutions are disappearing. So that was Fighting for America's Soul. Then there's a book called The Passions of Mankind. And this is interesting book because it goes back to Malthus. And I don't know how many people know this, but Thomas Malthus, who wrote his book on population, was provoked to do so by his father's admiration for the work of Condorcet and Godwin, who wrote very optimistic books at the time of the French Revolution. And in criticizing the utopian ideas of Godwin, Malthus said, if the laws of nations were really the source of the miseries that we see around us, it would not be an impossible task to remove them. But in fact, these laws and institutions are very light in comparison with the misery that is produced by the laws of nature and the passions of mankind. So the laws of nature and the passions of mankind are really the source of most of the evil that we see. And so this book explores that idea of Malthus, that our emotions are driving us in the wrong direction and driving us to do things which are really contrary to our survival. So I hope that is an interesting book. And now another book is called Fascism Then and Now. And that book was provoked by a question that arose in my mind of why the Allies, why England allowed Germany to rearm after the First World War. And so I go back and look at the history of why that happened. That the reason for it was that they regarded Hitler as a bulwark against communism. He was supposed to save the world from communism, and therefore rearmed and made strong compared with the Soviets. And that was the prevailing thought in England as they allowed Hitler to rearm Germany. Then the book looks at the rise of fascism in Europe in the 1930s, both in Germany and in Italy and in Spain, and compares it with what we see today. So today we see neo-fascism in the United States, especially in the Trump administration and in the far right. So also actually in right-wing parties all the way across Europe, we see neo-fascism. And so that is what is explored in that book. And then a little farther down, we have a book about a world federation. And that book, a collection of ideas, many of which are my own ideas, many of which are other people's ideas about how to reform the United Nations to make it stronger and use the present United Nations as a stepping stone to a federation. Now, what is a federation? A federation is a form of government which has the power to make laws that are binding on individuals rather than on nations. It is really a hopeless task to enforce international law by acting on nations as a whole, because without individuals, to make laws that are binding on individuals. And federations have been historically the most successful form of governance. So there's very much evidence historically that federations work, whereas confederations, such as the present United Nations, are too weak. The original Constitution of the United States was a confederation, but it was quickly realized that this was too weak, and it was reformed and made into a federation. And that has proved to be effective. And there are many other federations, successful ones throughout the world. For example, the European Federation, the Russian Federation, Australia is a federation, Brazil is a federation. Many examples showing that this form of government really works. And that is what we have to aim for in reforming the United Nations. Another book which you can see on the list of books that Arne is going to make available to you is called The Information Explosion. And this tells about the growth of our society from the invention of writing and printing up to the present day explosive growth of computer technology, which is an amazingly rapid growth. And so it is a history of the way in which humans interact with each other and exchange information. Another book in this list is called The Devil's Dynamo. And what does the title mean? Well, an industrial military complex is a devil's dynamo. It's a kind of machine where the huge profits of the weapons industries are fed back into the mass media and into the lobbying organizations which give money to politicians, which make them once more support the military-industrial complex and continue to sponsor wars. This circular flow of money is really the reason why we have war, why we cannot get rid of the institution of war. And so this book analyzes this culture of violence that results from a circular flow of money that might be called the devil's dynamo. Now, another book in the list is called Where Do We Come From? And that was inspired by Gauguin's huge painting, Where Do We Come From? What are we? Where are we going? And it tries to answer those questions, which, after all, are really questions that we ask ourselves about the meaning of human existence. So that book. Another book is called Climate Change, Population Growth and Famine. And that discusses the fact that these three factors, climate change, population growth, and the end of the fossil fuel era, will combine at perhaps the middle of the present century to produce a famine of very large proportions. So we have to work to try to avoid that. First of all, by trying to stabilize population growth, but also by working on agricultural research to try to find ways of feeding the growing world population. Then there's a book called Nuclear Weapons and Absolute Evil. And this discusses the threat of catastrophic thermonuclear war and tries to demonstrate that nuclear weapons don't make us safer at all. They are a genocidal or perhaps omnicidal threat to everyone on Earth. And unless we get rid of them, the small danger every year of a thermonuclear war will eventually accumulate, and we will, over the years, reach a point where the catastrophe becomes a certainty, not just a threat. So that was that book. And another one called The Climate Emergency, 2 Time Scales. Why 2 time scales? Well, because we need to act rapidly now in order to avoid feedback loops, which will make catastrophic climate change inevitable. But the worst effects of climate change lie in the long-term future. So it's very difficult to mobilize popular opinion to take political language, to take political action. We don't have visible evidence of these catastrophic effects, which we will see in the long term. People who are elderly, like myself, will not see them, of course, but future generations will see them. So this is the dilemma. We need to act immediately, but the consequences of the catastrophic climate change lie in the long-term future. So those are some of the books that I wanted to discuss with you. And thank you once again, Arne, for having me on this program. Thank you.
John, det er fint, men har du tanker om, at vi kunne lave flere interviews, hvor du uddyber nogle af de ting, du synes er mest væsentlige i øjeblikket? Altså på et senere tidspunkt.
Yes, let's go back and look at the book Rebuilding After Corona.
Yeah.
Perhaps since it's been such a long interview, we could come back to that in another try.
John Scales Avery, thank you for your talk or a lecture. But perhaps we can speak together in another time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look forward to that, Arne.
Yeah. Thank you. Hermed slut på videnskabsmanden og fredsaktivisten John Scales Averys oversigt over sine bogudgivelser af særlig relevans i dag. Interviewet foregik den 20. april 2020 med Arne Hansen som interviewer. Man kan genhøre John Scales Averys forelæsning på postkort på adressen flygtningeogfred.dk, som der også er muligt at lytte til på mobilens podcast-app ved at skrive flygtninge og fred. Det gælder også på YouTube. Tilkendegivelser er velkomne.